My name is Hannah Brooks. I was 29 years old when my parents gave me a choice that should never exist. Standing in a tiny church dressing room just 2 days before my wedding, my father looked me in the eye and said, "If your grandfather sits at the head table, your mother and I won't be here." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He spent his life pushing a janitor's cart, Dad said, adjusting his tie as if he were discussing a business report instead of family. I won't have people remembering that. My grandfather, Walter Brooks, was the man who packed my lunches, waited outside my school every afternoon, and tucked me into bed for 11 years while my parents chased careers in another city. To me, those rough hands never represented shame. They represented home. Still, my parents believed the greatest disaster my wedding could face was letting 200 guests see a retired school custodian seated beside the bride. They had no idea how wrong they were. Because before the night was over, my father's CEO would walk across a crowded ballroom, stop in front of my grandfather, and say words that would leave every guest frozen in silence. And after that, nothing in my family would ever be the same. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in Grandpa Walter's small, spotless house. Every room carried the comforting scent of fresh coffee and furniture polish. He believed every job deserved pride, no matter who noticed. Each evening, after locking the doors of Garfield Elementary where he worked, he would smile at me and repeat the same lesson. Leave every room better than you found it. At 7, I thought he was only talking about classrooms. Years later, I realized he meant people. My parents visited every few months. They never forgot birthdays or Christmas, but their trips always felt more like inspections than reunions. Dad studied my grades the way executives study financial reports. Mom admired the neighborhood only long enough to point out what could be improved. The older I became, the more obvious one painful truth was. My father never argued with Grandpa. He acted as if Grandpa simply didn't exist. Holiday dinners, company celebrations, promotion parties. Somehow, Walter Brooks was always the one person left off every guest list. Back then, I didn't understand why. I thought it was just another family habit. I had no idea that my father's silence was hiding a wound that had been festering since childhood. One that would finally explode in the days leading up to my wedding. My childhood belonged to Grandpa Walter far more than it ever belonged to my parents. While Mom and Dad climbed the corporate ladder in Columbus, Grandpa made sure I never felt forgotten. He walked me to school every morning, waited outside every afternoon, and somehow always knew when I needed encouragement before I said a word. Whenever I made a mistake, he never raised his voice. Instead, he'd hand me a rag, a broom, or a paintbrush and quietly say, "Leave every room better than you found it." That simple sentence shaped the person I became. My parents, on the other hand, measured life differently. To Dad, success had a title. To Mom, it had an address. Everything could be ranked, compared, and improved. When I graduated college and accepted a position as a mail carrier in Dayton, I couldn't wait to tell them I loved the job. It gave me steady work, good benefits, and the chance to know the people on my route. Dad listened in silence. Finally, he asked, "You're really proud of delivering mail?" It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. As if I'd chosen to waste my future. That conversation ended the same way most of ours did, with me trying to convince myself his approval didn't matter. Years later, Ethan Cole changed everything. He proposed on my mail route with a tiny velvet ring box clutched in nervous hands. Before he could finish asking, I'd already said yes. Unlike my parents, Ethan never cared about titles. He cared about kindness. We planned a simple wedding in Dayton. Nothing extravagant. Just family, close friends, good food, and one promise I refused to break. Grandpa Walter would sit beside me at the head table. For me, that wasn't negotiable. Then my parents invited us to an engagement dinner. Halfway through the meal, Dad slid a check across the table. $30,000. A proper wedding deserves a proper budget, he said with a satisfied smile. I hesitated. Accepting the money felt dangerous, but I convinced myself it was only a gift. I thanked them. Dad smiled far too quickly. Then he placed a second folder in front of me. I've already started organizing a few details. Inside wasn't a wedding plan. It was a corporate strategy. Rows of executives, regional directors, senior managers, and one name circled at the top. Raymond Whitfield, the CEO of Dad's company. At that moment, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. My wedding wasn't becoming a celebration of love. It was becoming the biggest business event of my father's career. Ethan noticed the change in me long before I admitted it. Every evening after work, I'd sit at the kitchen table surrounded by wedding notes, vendor contracts, and seating charts, trying to convince myself everything was under control. But every conversation with my parents ended the same way, with me giving up one more decision. One night he quietly closed the stack of essays he was grading and asked, "Whose wedding are we planning?" I forced a smile. "Ours." He looked at me for a moment before replying, "Then why do you sound like you're asking permission for every choice?" I had no answer. A few days later, Mom emailed the finalized seating chart. At first, everything looked professional. Every guest had a numbered table. The executives from Dad's company were seated near the dance floor. Family members were arranged carefully around them. Then I found Grandpa's name. Walter Brooks. Table 14. The table sat in the far corner of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar and only a few steps from the kitchen doors. My chest tightened. I immediately called Mom. "There has to be a mistake," I said. "Grandpa belongs at the head table." She answered with the calm voice she always used when she expected me to surrender. "Hannah, we're thinking about the overall presentation. The head table is reserved for the wedding party and the hosts. This arrangement simply looks better." "Looks better for who?" She ignored the question. "I know this is emotional for you, sweetheart, but sometimes you have to think about the bigger picture." The bigger picture. Those words echoed in my mind all evening. After work, I drove straight to Grandpa's house, ready to fight on his behalf. He was repairing the screen door when I arrived. When I explained what had happened, I expected disappointment, or maybe anger. Instead, he smiled gently. "It's only a chair, kiddo." "No," I replied. "It's what that chair says." Grandpa wiped his hands on an old work towel. "Respect doesn't come from where you sit. It comes from how you live." His words should have comforted me. Instead, they broke my heart. Because he wasn't defending himself. He was protecting me from choosing between him and my parents. A few days later, I met Aunt Carol for coffee. She listened quietly before telling me something I'd never heard before. "When your dad was 12, she said softly, "some boys at school made fun of Grandpa because he worked as a janitor." I frowned. "What happened?" "They dumped a dirty cleaning rag onto your father's lunch tray and laughed. One of them told him his father had forgotten to clean that spot." I stared at her in silence. "Your dad came home humiliated. He begged Walter to quit that job." "And Grandpa?" "He simply said, 'Honest work is never something to be ashamed of.'" Carol sighed. Richard never forgave him for that answer. Suddenly, so many pieces fit together. Dad hadn't spent decades trying to escape poverty. He'd spent decades trying to erase embarrassment. The problem wasn't Grandpa's job. The problem was that Dad had never healed from what happened as a child. For the first time in years, I actually felt sorry for him. But sympathy couldn't erase what he was doing now. Because the little boy who'd once been humiliated had grown into a man who was humiliating his own father, the pressure didn't stop after that conversation. If anything, it became worse. My phone rang almost every day. An aunt would remind me how much my father had sacrificed for his career. A cousin would tell me not to create unnecessary drama before the wedding. Even distant relatives, people I barely spoke to, suddenly had opinions about where one elderly man should sit during dinner. It didn't take long for me to realize what was happening. My parents weren't simply trying to change my mind. They were building a crowd around me, hoping I'd eventually give in just to end the argument. For a while, I almost did. Then one evening, Ethan came home looking unusually quiet. "My mom got a call from your mother today," he said. I looked up. "About what?" He shrugged. "She suggested our family should keep things modest during the reception. She even mentioned where they should sit." I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't just about Grandpa anymore. My parents were trying to control every part of our wedding. That weekend, Ethan's parents invited Grandpa over for dinner. Watching them together changed something in me. His father asked Grandpa for advice about fixing a loose gate. His mother laughed at stories from his years at the school. Nobody cared that he'd spent decades as a janitor. They cared about the man. For the first time, I saw Grandpa completely relaxed around family. On the drive home, Ethan asked quietly, "Who are you planning to dance with?" "The father-daughter dance?" I replied. He nodded. "I guess. Dad." He didn't argue. Instead, he asked one simple question. "Who actually taught you how to dance?" The answer appeared in my mind immediately. A small kitchen. An old radio. Grandpa counting softly while I stood on his shoes, laughing. I turned toward the window before Ethan could see the tears forming. The next morning, I called the wedding venue to make a small change to the menu. The coordinator hesitated. "I'm sorry," she said. "Only Mrs. Brooks can approve changes now." "What do you mean?" "Your mother updated the catering contract several weeks ago." I checked every contract that afternoon. The florist. The photographer. The decorations. One by one, my parents had quietly transferred everything into their control. Everything. Except one thing. The venue itself. Months earlier, I'd paid the deposit with my own savings, and the contract still carried only one signature. Mine. That evening, I spread every document across my kitchen table. Ethan watched silently as I sorted them into two piles. Theirs. Ours. Finally, I looked up. "They may have paid for almost everything," I said. Raymond Whitfield's words echoed through the ballroom long after he stopped speaking. No one seemed to remember the music, the food, or even the wedding for those few moments. Every eye was fixed on my grandfather. My father stood frozen, unable to hide the shock on his face. My mother quickly forced a smile and hurried toward Grandpa, suddenly eager to introduce him to people she had spent months trying to keep away from. It was too late. The truth had already spoken for itself. A few minutes later, Dad quietly pulled me aside. "Hannah," he said, his voice softer than I'd heard in years, "talk to your grandfather. Maybe he could put in a good word for me." I stared at him. The same man who had called Grandpa an embarrassment only hours earlier was now asking for his influence. I shook my head. "If Grandpa helps you someday, it should be because he chooses to, not because I ask him." Dad lowered his eyes, but I knew he understood my answer. When the DJ announced the father-daughter dance, the room turned toward my father. Instead, I walked past him. I crossed the ballroom until I stood in front of Grandpa. Holding out my hand, I smiled through tears. "You've been there for every important moment in my life," I whispered. "Will you dance with me?" His eyes filled with emotion. "I'd be honored, kiddo." As the music began, he gently placed one hand on my shoulder and the other around my back, just as he had years ago while teaching me to dance in his kitchen. For those few minutes, nothing else mattered. Not job titles. Not promotions. Not wealth. Only love. When the song ended, the guests rose to their feet in applause. Across the room, my parents quietly gathered their things and slipped out without saying goodbye. Months later, Grandpa established a scholarship for the children of school custodians, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, and maintenance staff. People whose work often goes unnoticed but keeps every school running. My father eventually sent me a short email admitting he had been wrong. I never rushed to answer it. Healing isn't something that follows a deadline. Even now, every Sunday morning, I still have breakfast with Grandpa. The wrinkled head table place card sits beside his kitchen window, carefully saved instead of thrown away. Whenever I see it, I remember the lesson he spent a lifetime teaching me. A person's greatest honor is never the title on a business card. It's the kindness, integrity, and dignity they leave behind wherever life places them.